Okay, class, welcome to Reading and Evaluating Arguments. The information here is from Academic Reading by Kathleen T. McWhorter. And today we're going to be going over the main part of logos, which is logic. Now, in the last presentation I gave you, I actually went over some basic elements of logic. But today I'm going to go into things in more detail. What are our learning objectives for the day? You will be able to recognize elements of an argument. You will be recognize types of formal arguments and to evaluate those arguments. An argument presents logical reasons and evidence to support a viewpoint. Parts of an argument. Issue, problem or controversy about which people disagree. A claim, the position of the issue. You'll notice this is why, by the way, we've moved from thesis and topic sentences to claims in English language and comp, because a thesis and a topic sentence are basically functions of writing, but a claim is a function of an argument. Support, which is reasons and evidence that the claim is reasonable and should be accepted, and refutation is dealing with opposing point of views. Now, in Toulmin's model, if you go back to the very beginning of rhetoric, that deals with how to handle refutations politely, and we're going to come back to that probably next quarter. Types of claims. Claim of fact. Claim that can be proven or verified by observation or research. Within 10 years, the destruction of wave forests will cause thousands of plant and animal species to become extinct. We're missing some words there, but you know what I mean. A claim of value. States that one thing or idea is better or more desirable than another. This you have to support. So requiring community service will make high schools produce more community-aware graduates. Claim of policy. Suggests that one ought to or should do something to solve a problem. To reduce school violence, more gun and metal detectors should be installed in public schools. All right, so you'll notice that a claim of value and a claim of policy are very close. The difference between a claim of value is it doesn't necessarily advocate a specific policy, where a claim of policy advocates a specific thing to be done. So a claim of value might be school violence is bad. That's actually a claim of value. Whereas a claim of policy is school violence is caused by guns and other things, so we need metal detectors to check them. Types of support. Reason, evidence, and emotional appeals. Now, reason is a general statement that supports a claim. All right. Evidence consists of facts, statistics, experience, comparison, and examples to show why the claim is valid. Now, if you think about the way we talk about, a claim statement, you have your topic, your subject, and your reasoning. Well, reason is actually here your subject, and the evidence is your reasoning. I know that's confusing, and that's because we talk about these things in different ways. This is why you can't just crib the vocabulary from these and use them in an essay, because it's actually confusing, particularly the more you know about it. Emotional appeals are ideas that are targeted towards the needs or values that readers are likely to care about. Now, emotional appeals of pathos, we dealt with that last week. And remember, that's going to be targeted towards a specific audience at a specific time. So this is where you have to understand the primary and secondary audience and all that kind of thing. We're not going to be dealing with emotional appeals as part of the argument that much. All right, so inductive and deductive arguments. Now, I defined these before. I'm going to try to make them a little bit clearer, though, than I did in that first video. Inductive reaches a general conclusion from observed specifics. By observing the performance of a large number of athletes, you could conclude that athletes possess physical stamina. Deduction begins with a major premise and moves to more specific premises. It's kind of the opposite. Athletes possess physical stamina. Because Anthony is an athlete, he must possess stamina. Deductive reasoning is axiomatic. It works like math. All right? Inductive reasoning is probabilistic. It works by the most likely outcome. So if you think about it, this is formal logic, deductive, and this is empirical logic. If you watch enough stuff, you think, okay, when it rains, it gets wet. Now, strategies for reading an argument. Think before you read. What does the title suggest in an argument? Preview it. Think about what it could be doing. Who is the author and what are his or her qualifications? What is the date of publication and why does that matter? Like, that's going to set the context, the exigence. That's going to set all sorts of things. What do I already know about the issue and what do I not know? Where am I going to be vulnerable to being misled? Read actively. Read every passage multiple times. Read once for initial impression. Read the argument several more times. Annotate as you read. That's why you guys do the dialectical journals all the time. Highlight key terms or terms you don't know. Diagram or map to analyze the structure. Do an outline just like you do for writing. All right? So that you can see the structure of the argument. Now, admittedly, on a test, you're not going to have time to do all that. But when you're asked to do a rhetorical analysis at home, you got all the time in the world. Well, all the time in the world other than the other classes and life you have. But you know what I mean. Evaluate the types of evidence. Is the evidence sufficient to support the claim? Look at the personal experience. What biases may be there? You do not have to accept an author or arguer's biases. You, in fact, need to not do so. Examples should not be used by themselves. They don't prove anything. They just support. Statistics can be misused, manipulated, or misinterpreted. I went over this on one of our sessions. I talked about how you can set the baseline poorly. You can use a small sample size to overgeneralize. You can use, percentage increases to make something sound like it's a lot bigger than it is. So make sure you deal with the math carefully. Comparisons and analysis, and analogies. Reliability depends on how closely they respond to the situation. You can use a bad analogy to mislead people. Relevancy and sufficiency of evidence. Is the evidence relevant and is it enough? Right? You might have good evidence, but it might not be enough to come to a radical conclusion. Also, make sure that they define their terms. Some people can play with a word having different denotations, like different meanings, or different connotations in a way that is misleading. So it's actually a logical fallacy called equivocation. I'm going to get to logical fallacies in another video. Make sure that cause and effect relationships are proven by evidence. All right. And read for stated or implied value systems. Are they consistent with their value systems? And if they aren't, what does that say? Recognize and refuting opposing point of views. Question the accuracy, relevancy, or sufficiency of an opponent's evidence, but do so based off evidence. If you do that, just as an accusation, you look uncharitable, and that weakens your argument. Does the author address opposing point of views clearly and fairly? And does the author refute opposing point of views with logic and relevant evidence? All right. Unfair emotional appeals. Look for these. All right. So while these are useful for both establishing an ethos and manipulating pathos, they're also profoundly unfair. That's why they're called unfair emotional appeals. So using highly biased language. Claiming false authority, and you see this in advertising all the time. Athletes endorsing underwear. What does an athlete really know about underwear? Movie stars selling shampoo. Associations. Watch for associations. A car being named a cougar to remind you of a sleek animal. A cigarette advertisement featuring a scenic waterfall. You can see how these associations work. Now, the unfair emotional appeals are the most obvious in advertising because you see them all the time, and it's constant. By a claim, outline the evidence to support the claim, what types of evidence are used, evaluate the adequacy and sufficiency of the evidence, what emotional appeals are used, and are they fair, and does the author recognize or refute counter-arguments? Comparing arguments. Compare the types of evidence used. Which argument do you find more convincing and why? What is further information would be useful in assessing the issue and picking which argument is better. All right, distinguishing arguments from non-arguments. An argument is a claim defended by reasons. More precisely, a passage is an argument if and only if it is a group of two or more statements, and one of those statements has a conclusion, is claimed to be supported by another, which is the premises. If you don't have a premises or a conclusion, it's not really an argument, it's just an assertion. You guys make assertions all the time. I can't stand it. Don't do it. I don't really care about your assertions because they don't prove anything. They're just your opinion and you're not backing them up. So remember, to be an argument, you need a premise. That's the assertion part. Mr. Varn is a bad teacher because he is boring. And a conclusion. Mr. Varn is a bad teacher because he is boring. What is the conclusion? Mr. Varn is boring and thus a bad teacher. The premise is Mr. Varn is a bad teacher. Is boring the conclusion or the premise? See, you're like, that doesn't make sense. Now, let's make that an actual argument. Mr. Varn is a bad teacher because he is boring. He drones on and on and on, and most of us fall asleep. That is an argument. You got a premise, Mr. Varn is a bad teacher because he is boring. And you got evidence to prove that I am boring and thus a bad teacher. Notice three things that follow this definition. Arguments consist of statements, sentences that make sense in regard to each other as either true or false. Questions, commands, exclamations, and other kinds of non-statements cannot be part of an argument. You can't, a rhetorical question is not actually an argument. No single statement, however long, complex, or controversial, is actually an argument. An argument must have two statements. Nothing counts as an argument unless it is claimed or intended that one thing follows from one or more of the other statements in a passage. In other words, a passage is evidence only if the speaker or writer intends to offer evidence or reasons why another statement should be accepted as true. Meaning, if they don't offer evidence, it's not an argument. 5 kinds of passages that sometimes are confused with arguments. Reports, unsupported statements of opinion or beliefs, illustrations, conditional statements, and explanations. These are not arguments. Read this for a second. Planet Earth was much drier in the Triassic than it is now, and there were deserts and inland areas. There were no flowering plants or grasses. They evolved much later. The most common trees were conifers similar to today's pines. Other large plants included yews, ginkgos, and palm-like cycads. Cycads. Sorry, guys. That's a weird word. Moisture-loving ferns and horseshoe-tails thrive by lakes and rivers. Is this an argument? This is a report. A report is a statement, a group of statements intended simply to convey information about a subject and doesn't actually offer any opinion. Keep in mind that reports of other people's arguments should be regarded as reports rather than arguments. Begin each day with prayer, work hard, love your family, make light of troubles, follow the golden rule, read the Bible, show kindness, read worthwhile books, be clean and pure, have charity in your heart, be obedient and respectful. In the day in prayer, these 12 rules, the Quaker's Dozen, were written long ago in a family Bible. I believe they still fit today's problem. Adapted from Arva Einstein, Grandma's Quaker's Dozen, and William McCoe's The Treasury of Words to Live By, 1959. Is that an argument? This is an unsupported statement of belief or opinion. There's actually no reason to accept this. There's none given. It's just listed as a thing and said that we believe this fits today's problems. Why does it fit today's problems? Well, in this passage, you don't know. An unsupported statement of belief or opinion is a statement or a set of statements in which a speaker or writer expresses his or her personal opinion, but does not offer reasons or evidence to back up that opinion, even if the description seems like it's offering evidence. Almost all groups agree that holding other groups to be inferior to themselves, the American Indians looked upon themselves as a chosen people, especially created by the Great Spirit, as an uplifting example for mankind. One Indian tribe called itself the only men. Another called itself the men of men. The Carib said, we alone are people. Rio Durant, Our Oriental Heritage, 1935. And yes, I realize this passage is problematic. This is an illustration. Illustration is a passage intending to provide examples that illustrate or support a claim, but do not provide convincing evidence that the claim is true. And admittedly, this is pretty close to an argument. But do you actually see any proof there? you got a generalization. All groups agree that holding other groups to be inferior to themselves. Then we have an example. The American Indians looked upon themselves as a chosen people. Then we have more examples from the Indians. But notice the Indians are only one group of people. You'd have to prove that generalization, examples of almost every group on Earth for it to be an actual valid argument. This is just an illustration of a possible point. 3 examples cited in the passage are clearly insufficient to support the author's claim that almost all groups agree in holding other groups to be inferior to themselves. This indicates the passage is intended to illustrate the author's claim rather than to prove it, because frankly that claim can't be proven. If Hal comes to the party, then Sarah will come to the party. This is a conditional statement. A conditional statement is an if-then statement. It is an assertion that such and such is true if something else is true. That's not actually an argument. Conditional statements are not arguments because arguments always consist of at least 2 statements, and conditional statements are only one statement. They are basically a premise. You'd have to prove that condition is true on the condition that B is true. You'd have to actually prove that, not just assert it. In the passage above, the speaker or writer isn't asserting that Hal will come to the party, nor is she asserting that Sarah will come to the party. Rather, she is asserting that Sarah will come to the party provided that Hal comes to the party. This is a single statement and thus not an argument. It doesn't actually offer any support. It just defines the parameters. I speak English because my parents sent me to boarding school in London. This passage is an explanation. An explanation is a statement or set of statements that seek to provide an account of why something has occurred, or that something is the case. In this passage, the writer or speaker isn't even trying to prove that he can speak English. That's obvious in the fact he is speaking English. We know he is speaking English because he spoke English. Rather, he is trying to explain why he can speak English. In other words, the arguments seek to provide evidence or reasons that something is the case, and explanations seek to explain why something is the case. For people who called and said Larry Bird was better than Michael Jordan, wake up! No one was ever better than Michael Jordan, not even Kareem in his glory, and not even Dr. J. This is from a newspaper column, and yes, I realize that these basketball stars are from the 90s, and this example is obviously from a long time ago. If you'd like me to substitute Kobe and current basketball players, do so in your head. This is a passage as an argument or not an argument. Or is this passage an argument or not an argument? If it is not an argument, is it a report, an unconditioned statement of opinion or belief, an illustration, a conditional statement, or an explanation? What do you guys think? For the person who called and said Larry Bird was better than Michael Jordan, wake up! No one is ever better than Michael Jordan, not even Kareem in his glory, and not even Dr. J. This is a non-argument. It's just a statement of opinions. The speaker simply asserts his opinion and makes no effort to defend it. When a democratic society is correctly understood to be one in which people live under constitutional government with universal suffrage and with securing of human rights, economic as well as political, for all citizens, it must be then recognized that a democratic society is not yet 50 years old in this country. Mortimer J. Adler, the Pavia Proposer in 1984. Is this an argument? This is an argument. The writer gives reasons to support its claim that democracy is less than 50 years old in the United States. All right? You can go into why. Jim Crow would be why, because we would not have universal suffrage, right? If a claim or a position is being set forth and no other explicit or implicit statement is used to support it, then the spoken or written material in the question is not an argument. Is this an argument? Nope, it's a conditional statement. It's an if-then statement, not an argument. All right. Now you see why you need to break this down. You need to know if something is an argument or not, and why it may or may not be an argument. Women my age know who to blame for their own self-loathing, eating disorders, and distorted body image. Barbie. So we're raising our vulnerable body-conscious girls to be aware that perpetually tiny-toed goddess with the impossible body and perfect face from Amy Dickinson's Measuring Up, Time Life magazine, November 20th, 2000. Is this an argument? Give it time. And it's not an argument, it's just an explanation. All it's explaining is why women who grew up in the 80s, or maybe a little bit before, have distorted body images and blame it on a toy. Although you cannot usually eliminate the personal feelings that are influencing your perceptions, you can become aware of them and try to compensate for their bias. For instance, if you were asked to evaluate a group of people, one of whom is a good friend, you should try to keep those personal feelings in mind in order to make your explanation as accurate as possible. Is this an argument? That's a non-argument. It's just an illustration. In his book, Natural Theology set forth the standard academic and theological wisdom of the 19th century. William Paley had compared nature to a watch. If you chanced upon a watch lying on the ground, he wrote, and then examined the intricate structure, you could not help but concluding that it was made by an intelligent designer. It could not possibly be the perfect product of mere chance. And yet, the natural world exhibits a much more complex order than any watch. Thus, Paley concluded that there must be an intelligent designer responsible for nature's fine arrangement. John F. Haught, Science and Religion, 1995. Is this an argument? It's a non-argument because it's a report. It's actually a report about someone else's argument, so it's a little confusing. But a report about someone else's argument is not an argument itself. It's just telling you someone else's argument.